Hey everyone, it's Harry. So right now, there are major changes unfolding that could affect your money, your job security, and whether promised payments ever show up. A Supreme Court decision is pending that could either keep Trump's tariffs in place or wipe them out entirely. And that one ruling connects directly to prices you pay, hiring decisions, and the talk around $2,000 rebate checks. If you're not paying attention, you could miss how one change helps you while another quietly creates new problems. Before we really get into it, I'm curious and let me know in the comments. Do you feel more worried or more hopeful about the economy right now, just in general? Alright, so here's where things stand. One of the biggest parts of President Trump's economic strategy has been tariffs, basically taxes on imported goods. The administration calls a lot of these Liberation Day tariffs, and they're not small. There's a baseline 10% on most imports and then much higher rates on certain countries, sometimes up to 50%, especially China, Mexico, and Canada. The White House says these are about trade fairness, national security, and even things like the fentanyl crisis. The idea is that these tariffs pressure other countries to negotiate and also bring in a lot of money to the U.S. government. Now, here's where it gets complicated. These tariffs were put in place using an old law from 1977 called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. That law was meant for emergencies like real national crisis. Lower courts ruled in 2025 that Trump didn't actually have the authority to use that law to impose these broad country-by-country tariffs without Congress. But, and this is important, they allowed the tariffs to stay in place while the administration appealed. So, they're still being collected right now. That appeal is now sitting with the Supreme Court. And when the justices heard arguments late last year, a lot of legal experts noticed something interesting. The court sounded pretty skeptical. Several justices questioned whether the law really allows a president to do this without Congress signing off. They didn't decide right away, and they haven't said when they will. January 14th has been talked about as a possible decision day, but there's no guarantee. The silence itself has created this weird pause in the economy where everyone is kind of waiting. And here's why that matters to you. Businesses hate uncertainty. They really do. When companies don't know if tariffs are staying or disappearing, they stop hiring, they delay investments, they pull back, and that's exactly what we've been seeing. Job growth in 2025 slowed way down, one of the weakest years outside of an actual recession. Unemployment ticked up to around 4.4% by the end of the year. Not catastrophic, but not great either. What's interesting, though, is inflation didn't explode the way many people expected. Some prices did jump. Things like beef, coffee, tomatoes, imported stuff, but overall, inflation stayed more controlled. A lot of businesses absorbed the cost instead of raising prices too much. The trade-off was fewer jobs and less expansion. So if you felt like hiring signs disappeared or hours got tighter, that's part of this story. Now let's talk about the part everyone asks me about, the $2,000 check. President Trump has repeatedly said that tariff revenue could fund what he calls a dividend for Americans, sometimes described as a rebate. He's mentioned numbers as high as $2,000 per person, not including high-income earners. The idea is that tariffs bring in so much money that some of it could be returned to households, especially middle-income families. And the administration has claimed tariff revenue could reach $600 billion. That number is doing a lot of work in this argument. Independent groups, though, paint a different picture. Estimates from nonpartisan organizations put actual tariff revenue much lower, more like $200 to $300 billion in a strong year. Still a lot of money, but not quite what's being advertised. And here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. Tariffs are not paid by foreign countries. They're paid by U.S. importers and eventually by consumers. That means you. So when people call this a dividend, some economists push back and say, well, it's more like giving people back some of the money they already paid through higher prices. One estimate showed households effectively paid about $1,700 in higher costs last year due to tariffs. So a $2,000 check, if it happened, wouldn't really be free money. It would be more like partial relief. Another big issue is cost. Giving every eligible person a $2,000 check could cost around $450 billion. That's more than the projected tariff revenue in some years. So, the math is tight even before you get into legal questions. And speaking of legal questions, this is where the Supreme Court ruling becomes critical. If the court strikes down the tariffs, the government may have to refund billions of dollars already collected to companies that paid those duties. There are already over 1,000 companies lined up in court waiting. If that happens, there may be no surplus revenue at all. In that scenario, the rebate checks are basically off the table, at least in the way they've been described. Now, the president has suggested he might not even need Congress to issue the checks, but most legal and financial experts disagree. Any broad program sending money to civilians usually needs congressional approval. We've seen one exception recently, the so-called warrior dividend check sent to service members, but that was funded through already approved defense allocations. That money was already authorized. The civilian rebate does not have that backing. There was a bill proposed, the American Worker Rebate Act, but it stalled. Some senators, even in Trump's own party, have openly criticized the idea. They argue that tariff revenue should go toward reducing the national debt instead of sending checks. So politically, this is far from settled. Another thing to consider is what happens even if the court rules against the tariffs. Trump could try again using a different legal authority. Congress has passed other trade laws that allow tariffs in specific situations. That process is slower and more limited, but it's possible. So even a loss in court wouldn't necessarily mean the end of tariffs altogether. It would just change how they're done. And here's the emotional side of this. Consumer confidence has dropped. People feel stretched. Groceries cost more than they used to. Insurance is higher. Rent is high. And for retirees, fixed incomes don't stretch as far. So when people hear $2,000 check, it hits something real. It feels like relief. Even if it's uncertain, it matters psychologically. That's part of why this idea keeps coming back. But I want to be honest with you because that's kind of the whole point of this channel. As of right now, there is no approved plan, no scheduled payment, and no guarantee. The checks depend on tariff revenue, congressional action, and a Supreme Court decision that could go either way. That's a lot of moving parts. What I'll show you next might surprise you though, because even without a check, this ruling could still affect your finances. If the court rules soon, businesses may start hiring again. Investment could pick up. That could mean better job prospects and more stability. On the flip side, a sudden end to tariffs could cause short-term market swings, maybe even higher interest rates if refunds strain the budget. So it's not as simple as good or bad. Now, let me say this clearly. If you're planning your finances, don't count on this money. If it happens, great. Treat it as a bonus. But don't delay bills. Don't make big purchases assuming it's coming. I've seen too many people get burned waiting on promised money that never arrives or arrives much later than expected. And also, keep an eye on how you're feeling. A lot of stress around money comes from uncertainty. Even just understanding what's happening can reduce some of that anxiety. You're not behind because you're confused. This is genuinely complex stuff and even experts disagree. As we keep watching this, I'll continue sharing updates, breaking things down calmly, and answering the same questions I see over and over. And yeah, if you haven't already, feel free to add your thoughts to the discussion earlier. I do read them. So, where does that leave us right now? Tariffs are still in place. The Supreme Court decision is pending. The $2,000 rebate is an idea, not a policy, and the economy is kind of holding its breath. What you can do is stay informed, stay flexible, and avoid making financial decisions based on political promises alone. All right, that's it for now. Take care of yourself, take care of your money, and I'll see you next time.